Welcome. I'm Matthew Phelps, co-author of the Turning to God's Word Bible study, The United Kingdom of Israel, Foreshadowing the Reign of Christ the King. Today we'll be talking about lesson 13 of our study, which covers the second book of Samuel, chapter 5, verse 6 through chapter 6, verse 23. As we left off the previous lesson, we've seen that David finally, after some ordeal and a long and protracted battle or war with the remainder of the house of Saul, has been finally named as king not only of Judah but also of Israel. So now we're transitioning into away from the period of Saul and his line as king and David as being king for real and totally. So we get to focus for the next little bit on what the kingship of David looks like as it emerges. So here, the first thing that we talk about is that there is this town in the land of Judah, not town, stronghold, that is held by some Jebusites that is called Jerusalem. I think as we later come to, spoiler alert, although not spoiling very far ahead, just into even these next few verses, start calling Jerusalem the city of David, we forget that it wasn't the city of David until after David was king in full, and all of these things we've heard leading up to now, David did not have control of Jerusalem yet. It's only now that he's king that that's going to happen. So, David goes up to Jerusalem and decides he wants to take it from the Jebusites, who mock him in the effort by saying it can be held by the blind and the lame. So what's going on with that? Definitely an insult, and David takes it as such, to the point that that the text describes his soul's hatred for the blind and the lame, which is not David being against sick people or weak people. The insult is extremely offensive to him, that you and your big army and all of you can't take the stronghold from even the weakest of us because the stronghold is so fortified and powerful. And David, of course, disagrees and gets his guys on board, and they crawl in through where the water comes into the city, which is not as well walled off as where people are supposed to come into the city. And as a result, they are able to take the city of Jerusalem, which David starts calling the city of David, and it will be the place from which he reigns, which is really a good idea. Find the best fortress you can find anywhere and make that the city where you rule. It's definitely a good way to fortify and strengthen your position. Not only does he take it, the city, and just set up shop there, though, he also continues to build and expand the already considerable fortifications. So David's first step as king is to find a place to rule as king that he is sure he can defend, and that is safe. Presumably after so many years running away from people trying to attack him, he likes the idea of finally having some security and safety now that he's king. And so he establishes himself in Jerusalem. So we've just seen David is settling in and establishing himself a bit here. The next step, or the next few things we're going to see here for a little while, are a result of the impact of the political situation of David being named king. First, the king of Tyre seems more than willing to try to build positive relationship. And so he sends some gifts and some offerings, basically suggesting, hey, please don't come and try to kill us all. Because David does have kind of a reputation for doing that for the people who are round about his territory. So, at least a good first move there, and we'll see how that relationship develops over time. And then we hear also that as David settles into living and ruling in Jerusalem, he does find some more wives, and he has a number of children. It should be noted, and maybe is obvious from the text, when Solomon is included among this list of children, and we'll see what comes up a little later, that he hasn't had all these children yet. This is a description of over the time that he's living in Jerusalem. By the way, David has a bunch more children. So this is sort of a summary from the point of view of establishing specifically the reign and the continued line of the kingship, that this is happening, but it'll happen kind of as we go forward as well. So we've seen the political situation developing. The king of Tyre is hoping to form a positive relationship with David, and now I see how the Philistines respond to the news that David is king in Israel, and they choose a slightly different approach, which is gathering all of their army together and approaching. So, as that's happening, David, as the king, thinks, so what should I do? Obviously, we should probably fight them, but as the king should do, we see he doesn't just rush in, and solid military leader though he is, and probably he would have no trouble winning such an engagement. We've seen him kill many, many, many Philistines over the course of the book. He does what Saul was always supposed to do, and frequently did in the early days, and then kind of got out of the habit of after God stopped talking to him, which is David asks the Lord, what should I do? Can I go out and attack them, and will you help deliver them into my hands? And God says, yeah, sure thing. That sounds like a good idea. Go do that. And David and the people do, and they win a glorious victory. And so we see, I think most significantly here, that the kingship is restored back to the pattern of, hey, we're being attacked by enemies. I know I'm the king, but God's really the one in charge, so let's ask God whether we should deal with this the way I think we should, or whether he doesn't agree. So kingship is kind of brought back in better order in terms of working with God now that we have David around. So where we left it, the Israelites went out and beat some Philistines, and then right after that we see the Philistines come back into the same place. David does the same thing. God, should we go down and attack the Philistines? And God says, don't do it from the front this time, but instead go around behind them and then wait. And when you hear that I'm marching against them and you hear the sound of that, then you can go, and then it'll be fine, which it was. But the situation and what God tells the people really reemphasizes again an idea we saw in the early days of the reign of Saul, that God is actually the one doing the fighting for the people primarily. And obviously they have to go and they have to fight, and not to take any credit away from their military achievements, but ultimately the great military strength of the people of Israel is in God, not in them. And so we see that being re-emphasized here, is that when God is going and fighting with them, they can't lose. So David is getting his affairs in order. He's got a place to rule from. He's kind of fixed relationships with the neighbors in one capacity or another, but at least things are calming down on that front. And now we see the next thing that he's focusing on is, if you can remember way back to Exodus, or less far back to 1 Samuel toward the beginning, there is this thing called the Ark of the Covenant that has been hugely significant in the history of the people, but since it has been taken back from the Philistines, has just kind of been sitting around and not really actively involved in what the people are doing regularly. Which is a weird thing. You'd think Saul would have wanted the ark around, the thing where the presence of God dwells. You maybe would think even when he wanted to know what God thought about things after God stopped talking to him through other people, maybe he could go find the ark and see if that could help. Saul seems to have had no conception of the value of this thing whatsoever, which I think is overall a commentary on Saul's relationship with God. David, on the other hand, says, I want God living in my city, and so we should go get it. And he doesn't just send like a couple guys to go grab it and take it back. He gathers 30,000 troops, which as you start reading, before it mentions the ark, it's like, oh, who's going to go fight now? This is a big army. And, it's expensive to keep an army like that assembled. He's pulling out all the stops. It's, I'm going to do this right. I'm going to gather everybody, we're going to go down, we're going to get the ark, and we're going to bring it back up to Jerusalem, and God will be with me in my reign, and won't that be great? Again, contrasting Saul and David. David wants God to be around and to be a part of what he's doing as king. And so they go down and they grab the ark, and you see there is also great celebration when they're in the presence of it as they start their journey back to Jerusalem. So David and a great many of the people are bringing the ark up to Jerusalem. Up not meaning north, but actually up. Jerusalem being on a mountain is above everything in the land. So you always talk anywhere in the surrounding land, if you're going to Jerusalem, about going up to Jerusalem. So now David is intending, with all of his people, to take the ark up to Jerusalem. Although here we hit a little bit of a logistical snag along the way. If you remember the establishment of the rules about building the ark and what you do and what it is, and definitely there was one thing you do not do with the ark, to the point that it has holes in it that you put poles through, and you carry the ark by the poles that you put through it, because you're not allowed to touch the ark under any circumstances, or you will die. That's been the rule. We really haven't seen anywhere that rule come into effect, because people did a pretty good job following it. But here we go, and this is unfortunately an incident of that, where Uzzah, being very well intentioned, the ark being carried along, is shaking and looks like it's going to fall, and you wouldn't want to let the Ark of the Covenant fall on the ground and have all those bad things happen either. And so he reaches out to steady it, and when he does, he dies. So this is probably for us as Christians a little bit of a tricky idea, to think of God as he's going to kill somebody who's clearly so well-intentioned and well-meaning over this thing. Why would God do that, and how can that happen, is the thing we're thinking about. I think first and foremost, our problem as Christians understanding this thing is we have failed to recognize ourselves how sacred the modern form of this, the thing we have access to now in the Eucharist, is. Because we are now allowed to touch and to even consume the presence of God in the Eucharist, that has normalized that is a thing that people can do. But more than that, it can, if we are not exceedingly careful, make that seem less sacred than this ark instead of more so. Because God could choose to come down and dwell on the ark, but the things that were in it were manna from the desert and the tablets of the law and the staff of Aaron, not the body of God himself. So what we have is more sacred, more profound, but we have, through baptism, gained access to the grace that allows us to receive the presence of God into ourselves without it leading to our death, but instead leading to our life. So we have missed, or it's easy for us not to see, that back then God was so far beyond humanity and so different from us that the idea of us humanity physically connecting with God was a thing that, not because God harbors any ill will, that's why he had the rule, don't touch it, because I can't both be present here and have you make contact with it and be able to live, because humanity was at that point so incompatible with God that the touch of that sacred thing was too much for a person, and that person would die. So this is not a vengeful thing on the part of God, that, oh, you touched my ark while you were trying to steady it, so I've got to zap you now. It was just the nature of what the ark was, that it was incompatible with being touched by human beings. So the good intention was not punished by God. The good intention probably kept the ark from falling over and probably was a good thing. It's just that Uzzah was not capable of touching the ark and living. And we are, through baptism and the grace given us by Jesus Christ. And that is a thing worth spending far more time than the length of this video reflecting fairly deeply upon, as it is kind of the core mystery of our faith. So we just saw that the ark there were some issues with the ark and transport. And then David made the decision, wait, maybe I don't need to take this into the city with me if what happens when you get, in a well-meaning way, do the wrong thing around it, you end up dead. Maybe it can be not here. So they leave it in the city of Obed-Edom, and they stop the procession and decide to go about their business, but people are continuing to monitor what's happening with the ark. It's still not the situation of Saul where they just sort of forget about it and don't worry about it. They're paying really close attention, and they notice that everything is going very, very well where it is, and much better than it was before the ark was there, and that as long as you don't touch it, then good things happen when it's around. Because again, God's presence is with you. So David decides, no, actually, I think I do want that in Jerusalem. So let's all get together again and go down and let's bring it back up, which they do. And they again are celebrating and rejoicing before the Lord. And then we see an interesting thing that will develop further as we move throughout this chapter, which is, how does the king dress for bringing the ark up? Does he put on a big fancy gold crown and purple robes with all kinds of gold jewelry and everything? No, that's not how David presumes to approach the presence of God. And if he didn't already think that God was present in this thing when he was doing it the first time, the second time he really knows what he's getting into. He's had two more pretty significant data points. One, if you touch it, it really does kill you. And two, if you don't and it's around you, things are going to go very well for you. This is a manifestation of the God that he loves. And so now for sure, when he's going down, he knows that. And so how does he dress? He puts on a linen ephod, which is for lack of a better word, the uniform of the priests. And he is dancing before the ark. So we're still bringing the ark up to Jerusalem, but now we're getting very close, and in fact are arriving. So as David is coming up into the city, first of all, there are very few children of Saul left alive at this point, but there is his daughter Michal, who's married to David, and she sees David coming up, and her reaction isn't, oh yeah, great, God is coming up to the city, things are going to be wonderful, I'm so glad my husband thought to do that, but instead she despises her husband for it. Probably a lot of complex reasons there. It wouldn't be super easy for her to be living in the city of David as where the kingship is, having grown up in a different city with a different king, her father, who is now dead. That could really be very hard for her, even if David's not the one who killed her. But again, we saw, or who killed him. But again, we also saw that Saul didn't really have any regard at all for this ark. He ignored it through his whole kingship. So she also very probably just doesn't get what's going on. She doesn't have, by her family background, anything close to the relationship with God that David does, or understand really what he's doing or why. And her view of the kingship is very different from David's. And so, as we'll see develop more, she doesn't think he's behaving as a king ought to behave. And then, as we move forward just a little bit, David doesn't exactly behave as a king ought to behave. He does something else. When they get the ark up, he does something that Saul got in a lot of trouble for, which is he offers sacrifices to God. Saul did it, of course, because he was told to wait for Samuel to appear, and then they would figure out what they were supposed to do in a military encounter, and he got impatient and took on the role there that was not his to take, and God was not so happy with that. In this instance, it is just rejoicing before the Lord and offering sacrifices not to get anything from God, but just to say, God, here, stuff offered to you because we're celebrating. And in that context, God seems to be totally fine with David offering these sacrifices and giving gifts as well to the people. So Typically, yes, offering a sacrifice is the role of the priest. David is stepping into it a little bit here, but it's not offensive to God because he's not presuming in the same way that Saul did. So, when David comes back from the celebration, he has a bit of an encounter now with his wife Saul's daughter, who, again, was not so thrilled with her husband's behavior, and who criticizes him essentially for not acting as a king does, but acting in a way that is vulgar. Vulgar being a word that just means of or like the crowd. And here we see the fundamental difference between David's view of what it means to be king and Saul's family's view of what it means to be king, which is David does not see himself as above the common people. He sees himself as one of them, and God still as the one in charge. And David is like maybe the best among equals, but not categorically different from and above the crowd in his role as king. And his wife seems to disagree with that assessment, and certainly we saw over time, power went to Saul's head, and he adopted that same mentality. Although in the early days, he certainly did not. But as he became ever more corrupt by power, he adopted that mentality. So there's a disagreement between David, who is king, and his wife, who is not, over what the king should do. And I bet we can all guess who's going to win that. So David's still having a little bit of an argument with his wife. We've seen her point, which is you're not acting like a king should. Now we see his response, which is, well, I'm acting like this not before the people, but before God, worshiping and celebrating before God, who, by the way, chose me over your father and his household. So I think I'm going to keep behaving this way, and whether that's okay with you or not. And this is between me and God, and this is how I think a king behaves toward the Lord. And then we see further God's choice in that David's wife never has children in all her lifetime, which is significant for a few reasons. One, there's that attitude, and maybe she's being punished, but that's kind of a small-minded way of looking at it, and I think there's a lot more going on here, which is a lot better, which is this is also then pretty much the end of Saul's line. We do see there's one other person from Jonathan that will continue the line as a remnant, as God tends to do, and that will be much better. But someone who could then be the mother of a future king in the line of David, who has such an incompatible view of what kingship looks like from the point of view of God, who could then be bringing up her son in the line of David to try to be a king like Saul and not like David, is not an awesome thing. And you can potentially see why God would think, we don't want the previous line contaminating the new line, so we're not going to allow that to happen. And so we see now David is established in his holy city, and he has God with him. This has been an overview of Lesson 13 of the Turning to God's Word Bible Study, The United Kingdom of Israel, Foreshadowing the Reign of Christ the King. For more information, consult our written study and visit us online at turningtogodsword.com.